The room went dead silent when the CEO announced his 3-year-old daughter would be taking over my division. She had a degree in fashion marketing. I had 7 years of managing federal medical logistics. When she asked if we could turn off the warehouse freezers at night to save power, and my boss actually nodded, I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply handed her the master admin token and smiled. They thought I was surrendering. They had no idea I was handing them a grenade with the pin already pulled. Before I tell you how my silence led to a federal investigation that shut them down, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to train a boss who knew less than you, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. My name is Vera, and in the volatile world of pharmaceutical logistics, I am what is known as a fail-safe. For 7 years, as the Vice President of Operations for Garrison Logistics, I lived my life measured in thermal degrees and delivery timestamps, serving as the invisible barrier between corporate chaos and patient safety. I am not a woman who chases titles or seeks validation through applause. I am a creature of precision, finding my satisfaction in the quiet hum of a perfectly calibrated cooling unit and the absolute immutability of a federal compliance log. My office was never designed for comfort. It was a command center lined with high-resolution monitors, tracking the pulse of 300 refrigerated trucks navigating the unpredictable highways of the American Midwest. I knew the specific mechanical temperament of every compressor in our fleet. I knew the traffic patterns of Chicago at rush hour better than I knew the lines on my own palm, and I knew, with a certainty that terrified most of my colleagues, that in this industry, stability is the most expensive luxury money can buy. For nearly a decade, I provided that stability to Garrison Logistics, allowing a mid-sized courier service to masquerade as a titan capable of handling government contracts, naively believing that my competence was a currency that would never devalue. The morning that dismantled my career began with the deceptive calm of a hurricane's eye. The air in the conference room was thick, smelling of stale coffee and expensive cologne, heavy with the specific tension that precedes a structural collapse. We were assembled for the final strategic review of Project Aegis, a $40 million federal contract to transport temperature-sensitive insulin across a 5-state region. This was not merely a delivery job, it was a logistical labyrinth that I had spent 6 grueling months navigating, rewriting our entire safety architecture to satisfy the Food and Drug Administration, sacrificing my personal life, my sleep, and my peace of mind to ensure Garrison Logistics was bulletproof. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, my presentation projected on the wall behind me, detailing the redundancy protocols I had personally designed. Garrison, the CEO, sat at the opposite end, rhythmically tapping a gold fountain pen against the glass table surface, a sound that betrayed his profound disinterest in the technical realities that kept his company legal. To his left sat Preston, our chief financial officer, a man who viewed safety regulations not as laws, but as negotiable suggestions that ate into his profit margins. I was in the middle of articulating why maintaining a dedicated fleet of certified drivers was a non-negotiable expense when the heavy oak doors swung open, shattering the professional atmosphere I had worked so hard to maintain. The interruption was performative in its disrespect. Blair walked in 20 minutes past the hour, clutching a venti iced latte and draped in a designer trench coat that likely cost more than the annual maintenance budget for one of our trucks. At 23, Garrison's daughter possessed a degree in luxury brand management and a resume padded with internships at European fashion houses, yet she walked into a room full of logistics veterans with the unearned confidence of royalty. She offered no apology for her tardiness, merely flashing a bright, vacuous smile that suggested time was a constraint for employees, not heirs. She breezed past the senior analysts and claimed the empty seat directly to my right, placing her sweating cup of coffee directly onto the master copy of the federal compliance dossier I had prepared. I watched in silence as a ring of condensation formed instantly on the paper, bleeding into the ink of the FDA seal, but I did not move it. I simply paused, allowing the silence to stretch, waiting for Garrison to correct the behavior. Instead, he beamed. His face, usually tight with the stress of quarterly projections, softened into a look of indulgent pride that made my stomach turn. He gestured for me to continue, but the gravity of the room had shifted irrevocably. We were no longer discussing infrastructure. We were witnessing a coronation. I forced myself to resume, keeping my voice steady, explaining that for Project Aegis, we needed to utilize active cooling containers capable of maintaining a strict range of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius for 72 hours, independent of the truck's power source. Blair raised her hand, bypassing the courtesy of waiting for a pause. Her voice was light, airy, and dangerously unburdened by knowledge. She asked if the containers had to be that aggressive industrial gray, suggesting that perhaps a softer blue or a vinyl wrap with the company logo would look better for the press release photos. The room froze. The engineers stared at their tablets. The operations managers shifted uncomfortably. I looked at Garrison, expecting him to explain to his daughter that we were discussing medical life support systems, not a perfume launch. But Garrison nodded thoughtfully, turning to Preston. He remarked that Blair had a valid point, that the company often overlooked the aesthetic narrative of logistics, and that perhaps a fresh perspective was exactly what was needed to modernize our brand identity. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the chilling realization that my expertise had just been outvoted by a color palette. Then came the execution, delivered with the casual brutality of a corporate memo. Garrison stood up, buttoning his jacket, and announced that in light of the magnitude of Project Aegis, he had decided to restructure the leadership of the operations division. He spoke in flowery corporate buzzwords about innovation, youthful energy, and vision, but the subtext was a blade. He declared that effective immediately, Blair would be stepping into the newly created role of Director of Strategic Logistics, and she would be the lead signatory on the Project Aegis contract. I sat completely still, my hands clasped on the table to hide the tremor of rage that threatened to surface. He didn't fire me. That would have been too honest. Instead, he turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and explained my new reality. I was to be demoted to senior advisor. My salary would remain unchanged, but my authority was stripped. My office, the nerve center I had built, would be given to Blair because she needed the creative space. I was to be relocated to a smaller office near the server room, and my primary responsibility for the next 6 months would be to mentor Blair, to download 7 years of institutional knowledge into her brain, to teach her how to run the division I had built from the ground up. I wanted to stand up, throw my security badge on the table, and walk out, leaving them to navigate the federal audits alone. But Garrison knew where to strike. As the meeting disbanded and the sycophants rushed to congratulate Blair on her unearned ascension, Garrison leaned in close to me, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like a friend sharing a concern. He asked about my mother. He asked how she was adjusting to the assisted living facility, the specialized memory care unit that cost $6,000 a month, a cost largely covered by the premium executive health insurance plan Garrison Logistics provided. He didn't make a direct threat. Men like Garrison never leave fingerprints. He simply expressed his hope that the transition would be seamless because he would hate to see any administrative hiccups disrupt the benefits package my family relied on. It was a masterstroke of emotional blackmail. He was holding my mother's medical care hostage to ensure I would train his replacement. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't see a leader. I saw a parasite. I nodded slowly, swallowing the bile in my throat, and said I understood the arrangement. The transition period was a slow, agonizing descent into absurdity. For the next 2 weeks, I attempted to perform the duties of a mentor, but it became immediately clear that Blair had no interest in the mechanics of logistics. She only wanted the prestige of the title. She treated the warehouse like a runway, and the staff like background extras in her personal reality show. I tried to walk her through the critical control points, explaining why we couldn't stack pallets of insulin higher than 4 feet due to airflow restrictions. She scrolled through her phone while I spoke, occasionally looking up to ask if we could redesign the warehouse uniforms because the neon safety vests were unflattering on camera. When I brought her detailed reports on carrier performance showing why we paid a premium for certified drivers, she waved them away, echoing Preston's complaints about legacy bloat. She had been listening to the CFO, who had convinced her that the primary goal of logistics was not safety, but cost reduction, and that I was merely an obstacle to their profitability. The conflict reached its breaking point on a Tuesday afternoon, a day I will remember as the moment I stopped trying to save them. We were reviewing the transportation budget for the upcoming quarter. Blair, emboldened by her father's constant praise, proposed a radical change. She wanted to terminate our contracts with the dedicated fleet of unionized, certified drivers and replace them with a gig economy solution, a network of freelance truckers who bid on loads via an app, promising 30% savings. She called it Uber for Pharma. I stared at her, unable to comprehend how someone could be so dangerously confident in their ignorance. I explained, with a patience that felt like physical pain, that maintaining the chain of custody was a legal requirement, not a suggestion. I explained that freelance drivers did not have the specialized insurance, the training, or the verified cooling equipment to transport temperature-sensitive biologics. I explained that if a single truck's cooling unit failed and the driver didn't notice because he was untrained, we would not only lose millions in product, we could kill patients. Blair rolled her eyes, a gesture of dismissal that sealed her fate. She told me I was being dramatic. She said I was stuck in the past, obsessed with what-ifs instead of what could be. She looked at me with a pitying expression and said that business was about taking risks, and that her father agreed my approach was too conservative, too expensive, and too slow. That was the moment the last tether snapped. It wasn't anger I felt, it was a profound, icy clarity. I realized that they didn't want my expertise, they wanted my compliance. They wanted me to be the safety net that caught them when they fell, the janitor who cleaned up their messes while they took credit for the successes. But I was done cleaning. I went back to my temporary office, the small windowless room by the servers, and I began the process of handing over. I did not sabotage the system. I did not delete files. I did not plant viruses. I simply followed their instructions to the letter. They wanted Blair to be in charge? Fine. She would be in charge of everything. I opened the central administrative console and began to transfer the permissions. I revoked my own access to the override codes, the emergency shutoff protocols, and the vendor verification systems. I transferred the master admin rights to the account created for Blair. I prepared the handover documentation with malicious compliance. In the past, for new hires, I would create cheat sheets, simplified, color-coded guides that distilled complex regulations into actionable steps. I did not do that for Blair. Instead, I accessed the company archives and downloaded the raw, unedited text of the Federal Code of Regulations for Pharmaceutical Transport, Title 21, Part 205. It was 400 pages of dense, impenetrable legal jargon. I printed it out, bound it in a heavy black binder, and placed it on her desk. It contained every single answer she would ever need, hidden inside a fortress of text she would never read. Then, I took the physical token, the encrypted USB key that authorized high-level changes to the temperature monitoring system. This was the nuclear key of our operation, the only thing that could override the automated safety shutdowns. I walked into her office, where she was busy ordering new ergonomic furniture online. I placed the USB key on her desk and told her that this was the master admin token, and she needed to keep it secure. She didn't even look up from her screen. She grabbed the key and tossed it carelessly into her Prada handbag, where it clattered against a tube of lip gloss and a set of car keys. She muttered a distracted, "Thanks, Vera," in a tone that suggested I had just handed her a breath mint, completely unaware she was now holding the detonator to her own career. My last day was unceremonious. There was no cake, no card signed by the team. The staff, the people I had hired and trained, looked at me with sad, frightened eyes, but they said nothing. They knew that associating with me was now a political risk. I packed a single box with my personal items, a framed photo of my son, a stress ball, and my favorite pen. I left the files, the awards, and the 7 years of blood and sweat on the walls. I walked to the elevator, and before I pressed the button for the lobby, I stopped at the security panel. As the outgoing VP of Operations, I still had biometric access to the entire building. I placed my hand on the scanner, navigated to the user menu, and selected my own profile. I pressed Delete. The light on the scanner turned from green to red. I was officially locked out. But more importantly, they were officially locked in with a system they did not understand, controlled by a woman who thought a USB security key was a keychain accessory. I walked out of the building and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the parking lot. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, panic, mixed with an intoxicating lightness. I got into my car, drove to the gate, and handed my badge to the guard, a man named Sam whom I had known for 5 years. He looked confused, asking if I was leaving early. I told him I was taking a long vacation. I drove home, turned off my company phone, placed it in a drawer, and then did something I hadn't done in a decade. I booked a flight to Cabo San Lucas. I didn't tell Garrison. I didn't tell Preston. I just vanished. I knew that the silence I left behind would be louder than any scream. While I was sipping sparkling water on a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean, trying to force my brain to stop calculating braking distances and humidity levels, the rot at Garrison Logistics began to set in. It wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, creeping decay. Emboldened by my absence and eager to prove her Uber for Pharma concept, Blair wasted no time. She canceled the contracts with our dedicated carrier partners, the ones with the specialized refrigeration units and the drivers who knew how to handle sensitive cargo. In their place, she signed a deal with a budget freight broker that Preston had recommended, a company that promised 30% savings by utilizing flexible capacity, which was a polite corporate term for random trucks with zero medical certification. Dr. Kowalski, the head of quality assurance, and the only other person in the building who understood the science of what we did, tried to stop her. He sent emails citing the specific clauses of the FDA guidelines that forbade the use of unverified carriers. Blair forwarded the emails to her father, complaining that Dr. Kowalski was being obstructionist and refusing to embrace the new vision. Garrison, seeing only the projected savings on the quarterly spreadsheet, sided with his daughter. He told Kowalski to get on board or get out. Kowalski went silent, just as I had. He knew, as I did, that you cannot argue with gravity. You just have to wait for the fall. 2 weeks after I left, the heat wave hit. It was a massive high-pressure system that settled over the Midwest, pushing temperatures in Chicago and Louis into the high 90s, with humidity levels that made the air feel like soup. In the world of cold chain logistics, a heat wave is not just weather, it is an enemy combatant. Under my watch, we would have activated Code Blue protocols, rerouting trucks to night driving, doubling the amount of dry ice in the passive containers, and putting the warehouse backup generators on standby. But I wasn't there. And the protocol binder I had left for Blair was sitting under her monitor, used merely as a stand to elevate her screen to eye level. The notification came through on a Tuesday afternoon. I wasn't there to see it, but I know exactly how it happened because I built the system. A red alert would have flashed on the main dashboard in the control room. Temperature deviation. Sector 4. This meant that the internal temperature of a truck carrying $2 million worth of insulin had risen above 8 degrees Celsius. In the old days, this would have triggered an immediate response. I would have been on the phone with the driver, directing him to the nearest safe haven with a power hookup. But the new drivers didn't answer their phones. They were freelancers, paid by the mile, not by the quality of the cargo. The alert likely beeped in Blair's office. She probably looked at it, annoyed by the noise. She might have remembered Preston saying something about the sensors being too sensitive or glitchy. She had a choice in that moment. She could have called Dr. Kowalski. She could have called the emergency support line. But admitting a problem would mean admitting that her new, efficient trucking strategy was failing. It would mean going to her father and saying she messed up, and people like Blair, who have lived their entire lives shielded by a safety net of money and influence, do not know how to admit failure. So, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She managed the perception, not the reality. She minimized the window on her computer screen. She assumed it would correct itself. She assumed that because it was nighttime, the air would cool down eventually. She applied the logic of a household refrigerator to a 53-foot metal trailer baking on asphalt. The truck kept moving. The cooling unit, strained by the extreme heat and lacking the maintenance that I had always scheduled, began to shudder and fail. Inside the trailer, the temperature climbed. 9 degrees, 10 degrees, 12 degrees. The insulin, a delicate protein structure held together by chemical bonds that required a specific thermal environment, began to denature. It didn't explode. It didn't change color immediately. It simply died, It turned from a life-saving medication into a useless, cloudy liquid. Back at the headquarters, the system continued to scream silently. The data logs were capturing every second of the disaster. Every degree of rise was being written permanently onto the server's hard drive, the risk assessment logs that I had designed to be immutable, unchangeable, and brutally honest. Blair didn't know this. She thought reality was something you could negotiate. She thought that if she just delivered the boxes on time, nobody would check the details. She was operating under the fake it till you make it philosophy that works in fashion marketing but is considered a crime in pharmaceutical safety. By the time the truck arrived at the distribution center for the regional hospital network, the internal cargo temperature had hit 26 degrees Celsius. The shipment was effectively cooked. The receiving dock manager at the hospital, a woman who took her job seriously, would have asked for the temperature readout before signing for the delivery. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment where the system I built would catch the error and prevent the spoiled drugs from reaching patients. But Blair was about to make a decision that would transform a logistical failure into a federal crime. Garrison, panicked by the potential loss of the contract and the humiliating prospect of admitting his daughter's first major project was a disaster, would intervene. He would look for a way to fix the numbers. He would remember the USB key. He would remember the master admin token, sitting in the bottom of a Prada handbag next to the lip gloss, and he would think, in his arrogance, that he could rewrite history. I was thousands of miles away, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when my personal phone, the one I kept for emergencies, only buzzed with a specific vibration pattern. It wasn't a call. It was an automated security email from the server I had left behind. Master admin token usage detected. Override protocol initiated. Data modification attempted. I read the message, and a cold, grim satisfaction settled over me. They hadn't just crashed the car. They were trying to paint over the dents while the engine was still on fire. They had walked right into the trap of their own incompetence. I took a sip of my water, feeling the cool condensation on the glass, and waited. The silence was over. The storm had arrived. The digital alert that flashed across my phone screen in Cabo was merely the overture. The true symphony of destruction played out 3 days later on a humid loading dock 2,000 miles away. The shipment of insulin, now compromised at a molecular level but digitally masked by a lie, arrived at the central distribution hub of the regional hospital network. On paper, everything appeared impeccable. The temperature logs, which had been clumsily overwritten by Blair using the administrative credentials I had left behind, showed a flat, perfect line of 4 degrees Celsius throughout the entire journey. It was a statistical impossibility for a truck moving through a Midwestern heatwave to maintain such perfection without a single micro-fluctuation, a nuance that a seasoned logistics manager would have spotted immediately as a fabrication. However, Garrison and his daughter were banking on the cynic's gamble. They assumed that the receiving clerks were overworked, underpaid, and inattentive. They believed that in the modern world, the paperwork was the product, and the medicine was merely the packaging. It was a fatal miscalculation of how the medical industry operates at the ground level, where the stakes are not profit margins, but human lives. The receiving manager at the hospital was not an exhausted clerk shuffling papers. She was a veteran pharmacist named Sarah, a woman of uncompromising standards whom I had personally trained on compliance protocols 3 years prior during a rigorous vendor audit. She did not trust paper. She trusted her eyes. When her team broke the seals on the pallets, she didn't just scan the barcodes and sign the manifest. She pulled a random sampling of the vials and held them up to the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the warehouse. Insulin, in its stable and effective state, is a clear, colorless liquid, indistinguishable from water. But the fluid swirling inside these vials was cloudy, filled with microscopic precipitates that looked like swirling dust, the undeniable physical evidence of thermal shock. The delicate protein structures had unraveled in the heat, rendering the medication not only useless but potentially immunogenic, capable of triggering severe allergic reactions in patients. Sarah looked at the cloudy liquid, then down at the pristine temperature report in her hand, and she understood immediately that she was holding a crime scene. She did not call customer service. She did not ask for a refund. She initiated a biohazard quarantine protocol for the entire lot and dialed the direct line of the Office of Criminal Investigations at the Food and Drug Administration. Back at the headquarters of Garrison Logistics, the atmosphere was likely one of premature and arrogant celebration. I can vividly imagine Garrison pouring himself a glass of his expensive scotch, congratulating Preston on massaging the data to save the quarter, and telling Blair that she had successfully navigated her first executive crisis. They truly believed they had pulled off a sophisticated corporate maneuver, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just committed felony fraud against the federal government. Their illusion of control lasted exactly 48 hours. The collapse did not begin with a shout or a dramatic courtroom objection. It began with the quiet, terrifying arrival of 3 black sedans in the company parking lot. I was not there to witness it, but the security logs, which I could no longer access but whose architecture I knew by heart, would have recorded the entry of federal agents at precisely 9 in the morning. These were not local police. These were agents from the FDA and the Department of Justice. They didn't come to talk. They came to seize. They bypassed the receptionist, marched straight to the server room, and began taping off the racks that held the hard drives with evidence tape. They moved with the dispassionate efficiency of people who already had the evidence and only needed the hardware to confirm it. When the news finally reached me, I was sitting in a quiet cafe on the coast of Baja, watching the tide roll in with rhythmic inevitability. My phone rang, displaying a number I recognized as the legal counsel for the regulatory board. I answered on the second ring, my voice steady, betraying absolutely nothing. The voice on the other end was clipped and formal, informing me that a federal investigation had been opened regarding the falsification of safety data and that my presence was required for a mandatory deposition. They asked if I was aware of the anomaly. I told them, truthfully, that I had been locked out of the building and the system for weeks. I told them I would cooperate fully. I hung up the phone and felt a profound sense of release. The waiting was over. The machinery of justice, slow and grinding, had finally caught the gears of Garrison's arrogance. I returned to the States, not as a suspect, but as a critical witness, though Garrison certainly tried to paint me as the villain in the court of public opinion. In the days leading up to the hearing, his high-priced legal team launched a frantic PR campaign, leaking stories to industry blogs suggesting that the disgruntled former vice president had sabotaged the system out of spite before fleeing the country. It was a desperate narrative, one that might have worked if the evidence were merely circumstantial or based on verbal testimony. But I had spent 7 years building a system that did not rely on, he said, she said. I had built a system that relied on metadata, on unalterable timestamps, and on the immutable reality of digital footprints. The deposition took place in a windowless conference room in a federal building in downtown Chicago. The air conditioning was set to a chill that reminded me of the warehouse, a temperature that keeps things preserved and sterile. Garrison sat across the long metal table, flanked by 3 defense attorneys who looked bored and expensive. Blair was there too, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. The arrogance that had fueled her takeover was gone, replaced by the trembling anxiety of a child who has broken an antique she cannot fix. She refused to meet my eyes, staring intently at her manicured hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Preston, the CFO, was sweating through his dress shirt, tapping his foot in a rhythm of pure, unadulterated panic. The lead investigator, a man named Agent Miller with eyes like flint and a demeanor that tolerated no nonsense, opened a thick folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Garrison. It was the temperature log, the falsified one. He asked Garrison if he recognized the document. Garrison leaned back, feigning confidence, and stated that this was the standard compliance report generated by the system I had built, implying that any errors were inherent to my design. He was digging his own grave with every word. Agent Miller nodded slowly, allowing the lie to hang in the air. Then produced a second document. This one was different. It was a raw server log, a dense stream of code, hash values, and timestamps that looked like gibberish to the uninitiated but read like a signed confession to anyone who understood the architecture. Agent Miller pointed to a specific line of code highlighted in yellow. He explained, in a voice devoid of emotion, that at 10:42 p.m. on the night of the incident, a manual override command was executed using the master admin token. He explained that the system, per the security protocols I had installed 3 years ago following a minor audit, tagged every manual entry with the unique digital signature of the user and the physical MAC address of the device used. He looked at Garrison and asked, simply, why the critical safety data was overwritten by a user profile named Admin Blair from a computer located in the CEO's private office. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Garrison's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He stammered, trying to weave a new lie, claiming that perhaps I had stolen Blair's credentials, that I had hacked in remotely to frame them. It was a pathetic attempt, one that Agent Miller dismantled with a single sentence. He produced my flight records and the IP logs from the hotel in Mexico. He proved, mathematically and geographically, that I was 3,000 miles away, disconnected from the grid, at the exact moment the crime was committed. Then, he turned to the final piece of evidence, the notification from the protocol I had privately named the Tamper-Evident Logging System. I spoke for the first time. I looked directly at Blair. Not with anger, but with a calm, clinical pity. I explained to the room that when I handed over the master admin token, I wasn't just handing over power, I was handing over accountability. I explained that the system was designed with a zero-trust architecture. The moment an unverified modification was made to a locked FDA record, the system didn't just allow it, it silently archived the original, unaltered data and emailed a copy to an encrypted off-site server, a server that only the original architect could access. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple, encrypted flash drive. I placed it on the metal table with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside that drive was the truth. The real temperature readings showing the insulin cooking at 30 degrees Celsius, preserved in amber before Blair's edit tried to erase them. The reaction was visceral. Blair let out a sob that sounded like a gasp for air. She looked at her father, waiting for him to save her, to pull some executive lever that would make this nightmare go away. But Garrison wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the flash drive as if it were a bomb that had already detonated. Preston, realizing the ship was sinking and there were no lifeboats, began to speak over his lawyer's objections, babbling about how he had only advised on cost-cutting measures, claiming he never authorized fraud. Dr. Kowalski, who had been subpoenaed as a character witness, sat in the corner and quietly corroborated every word I said, producing the email chains where Preston had explicitly denied the budget for safe transport. The room descended into the chaotic noise of defense attorneys trying to silence their clients, but I heard none of it. I only heard the quiet hum of the air conditioner, the sound of a system working exactly as it was designed. The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and comprehensive, a cascade of consequences that stripped the flesh from the bones of Garrison Logistics. The Food and Drug Administration did not merely fine the company, they issued a warning letter that effectively acted as a corporate death sentence. They suspended the company's license to transport pharmaceutical products pending a full criminal inquiry. In an industry built entirely on trust and certification, this was the equivalent of a heart attack. The news broke publicly within 48 hours. The stock, which Garrison had been so obsessed with inflating, lost 80% of its value in a single morning of trading. The contracts with major hospital networks were voided immediately, utilizing the material breach clauses that I had once warned Garrison about, warnings he had dismissed as pessimism. Garrison was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and violations of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The image of him being led out of his office in handcuffs was splashed across the front page of the industry trade journals, the same journals he had once paid to run puff pieces about his visionary leadership. He tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering to pay massive fines, but the prosecutors were looking for a scalp to hang on the wall as a warning to other logistics firms cutting corners. He was facing real prison time, not the country club rehabilitation he might have expected. His arrogance had not just ruined his business, it had cost him his freedom. Blair's fate was perhaps more tragic in its mundanity. She was not charged criminally, as her lawyers successfully argued that she was acting under the duress and direction of her father and lacked the technical competence to understand the implications of her actions. It was a defense built on the admission of her own uselessness. However, her career was over before it had truly begun. Her name was toxic. No reputable company would hire the woman who had signed off on a shipment of spoiled insulin. The last I heard, she had moved back to the East Coast, working in an entry-level position at a fashion boutique, far away from the responsibilities she had once treated as a game. Preston turned state's witness, testifying against Garrison to save his own skin, cementing his reputation as a coward. Dr. Kowalski was appointed as the interim administrator by the bankruptcy court to oversee the liquidation of assets, a grim task he performed with the solemn dignity of a coroner. 6 months after the collapse, I found myself standing in the lobby of what used to be Garrison Logistics. The building had been sold to a global shipping conglomerate, a competitor that valued the infrastructure I had built, even if the previous owners hadn't. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there as the new chief operating officer of the acquiring firm. The new owners had approached me a week after the deposition, offering me a partnership stake and full autonomy to run the division. They didn't hire me for my resume. They hired me because I was the woman who had proven that the system matters more than the ego. I took the elevator up to the executive floor. The space had been remodeled, the gold-plated fixtures removed and replaced with clean, functional steel. I walked past the office that used to be mine, the one Garrison had given to Blair. It was now a conference room, filled with serious people analyzing real data. I walked to the corner office, the one that had belonged to Garrison. It was empty, awaiting my furniture. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling logistics park, watching the trucks move in perfect, synchronized lines. I thought about the 7 years I had spent holding up the sky for people who never looked up. I thought about the late nights, the missed birthdays, the stress that had eaten at my stomach lining. I realized that my revenge wasn't the destruction of Garrison Logistics. That was merely gravity taking its course. My revenge was standing here, in the wreckage of their arrogance, and realizing that I didn't need them to validate my worth. I had been the spine of the company all along. When they removed me, they didn't just lose an employee, they performed a self-lobotomy. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my son, asking if I would be home for dinner. I typed back a simple, yes. For the first time in years, I didn't have to check the server logs first. I didn't have to worry about a heat wave in the Midwest or a broken compressor in Omaha. I had built a new team, one that respected the physics of the job. I pocketed the phone and turned away from the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the office. But for the first time in a long time, the temperature was perfectly controlled. The legacy of Garrison Logistics would be a case study in business schools, a warning about the dangers of nepotism and the high cost of ignoring competence. But my legacy was different. My legacy was the 300 trucks currently on the highway, carrying vaccines, insulin, and cardiac medication, all kept at a precise, unwavering 4 degrees Celsius. They moved safely through the night, protected by protocols that were no longer invisible, guided by a hand that was steady, experienced, and finally, undeniably, in charge. I sat down at my desk, and opened the laptop. The screen glowed with the green status bars of a healthy network. I allowed myself a small, private smile, then closed the file on the Garrison era. There was work to do, and this time, no one was going to interrupt me. They wanted me to be a stepping stone, but they forgot that stones can also be walls. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a strategy. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, we often forget that the most dangerous force is the person who knows exactly how the machine works and quietly decides to stop fixing it. If you've ever had to walk away from a place that didn't value you to save your own sanity, know that you didn't quit. You evolved. If this story spoke to you, like, comment, "Not my emergency" below, and share this with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't defined by a title. Subscribe for more stories where competence finally wins.